the difference between hearing and listening is the action you take. So a lot of people hear things, but when you listen effectively, you actually take action that means something to the person speaking. Too many people hear a lot of things and don't do it.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time as well, especially on a Thursday night. My name is Patrick. I'll be moderating and hosting a little bit in regards to tonight. But first and foremost, I'd like to thank Oscar for taking his time. And in regards to PDF, for those of you that don't know PDF, or I'm assuming we've got a few regulars here, PDF was started about 10 years ago as a volunteer organization, essentially to help out people that were, I guess, within, looking to improve themselves from a career perspective. And it's, since then organically grown into, we've got different platforms and different mediums to help out. And what I like most about PDF is the fact that we can get people like Oscar to volunteer his time, especially he did, come back from Cairns from last week where he talked in front of, I think he mentioned 250 people. So, we really appreciate time. So thank you, Oscar. And then in regards to Oscar, just a quick intro, and then I'll leave it to you. But Oscar's been within the, I guess, the professional services industry for many, many of years. Previously worked at Microsoft as a director, and then since then has gone on to be a, author and host of the Apple award-winning podcast Deep Listening, and also a very, sought after keynote speaker. He consults with organizations such as CBA, Google, HSBC, Macquarie Bank, Microsoft, to name a few. And I guess one question I had, Oscar, was, during it, obviously you were at Microsoft, and then after that you went on to Polycom. What made you, I guess, get into your line of work right now, which you've been doing for, almost the last 10 years?
Yeah, take me back to April of 2008, Pat. I was sitting in a budget setting meeting between Seattle, Singapore, and Sydney. In the room in Sydney were 18 people. In Singapore via video conference was 12. There were another 32 on the video conference in Seattle. And we were setting the budget for the next financial year. And at the 20-minute mark, my vice president, who was in the room in Sydney, looked me straight in the eye, and at the 20-minute mark said, "Oscar, you need to stay behind at the end of this meeting." And in that moment, Pat, the only thing I was thinking about was how much money have I got in my bank account, because I'm certainly going to get fired. And for the balance of the meeting, which actually finished early, it was a 90-minute meeting, and it ended up finishing at about the 55-minute mark. And the reason I know that is because I was sitting down and looking at Tracy in the eye at 10 o'clock exactly. And she said, "Please close the door." And I thought, oh, okay, this is not a good sign. Please come and sit here next to me. That was definitely not a good sign. "You don't know what you did at the 20-minute mark." I'm getting fired, and I have no idea why I'm getting fired. She said, "Oscar, at the 20-minute mark, you changed the course of this meeting. If you could code the way you listen, you could change the world." And despite the fact she said something incredibly profound, despite the fact that she showed she was a good listener in that moment too, the only thing I could think about, Patrick, was all the money I'd taken out of my virtual bank account in my mind, I was putting back in my virtual bank account. All I could think about is, I haven't been fired. I haven't been fired. I've still got a job. And I walked out of that room quite frustrated, to be honest, because I got an extra $218 million on my budget line. And then 6 weeks later, the CFO, Brian, said to me, "Oscar, can you come to my finance team meeting tomorrow, because I want you to audit my listening?" Okay. And I went, "Brian, have you been talking to Tracy? What's this listening caper thing all about? I got $218 million extra on my budget. I've got to figure out how to market, sell, get out across Australia next year." He says, "Oscar, I'll make it really easy for you. It's not a request. I'm telling you to." So I went, "Oh, okay. if you say it so elegantly, thanks for whacking me over the head with a stick. And the next morning, where I sat through this 3-hour meeting for the first time in my life, I had to look at somebody and how they listened and went, wow, that's really weird. He interrupts a lot. Wow, that's really weird. He didn't actually listen to the question. Wow, that's really weird. He's not listening to what they're not saying. Gee, he doesn't use any silence. And I started the process of coding how I listen. And now I'm on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world. So that's a very long version of that story, my friend.
No, but it's a good story, and I guess from those small situations born, I guess your calling and what you've achieved.
Yeah, it was interesting. About 4 months later, Tracy also said to me in a completely different meeting, she said, Oscar, when you ask questions, people pay attention, but they don't pay attention when you ask them at the back end of a meeting. As a card-carrying member of the introvert community, Oscar, I encourage you to ask those skillful, powerful, specific questions much sooner in the meeting. And I think for anybody on this call who may have a card-carrying member of the introvert community in their back pocket or in their purse, that tip served me really well to speak up earlier. And how I practiced that was by saying, look, my idea isn't fully formed, but here's what I'm thinking, or here's my question. And as I started to build that muscle and build that confidence, people would look to me to speak up much earlier in meetings as well. I think extroverts do a really important job of energizing the group, rallying the troops, being a cheerleader. I think introverts equally have a powerful role to play because they don't have to speak out aloud to get their idea out. They can rehearse it in their mind and make it really precise, really specific, and really powerful. And, somebody like Megumi, who's on the call, does a great job of shining a spotlight on the power of the quiet leaders. So leadership isn't always about charisma, and that's why I think it's important that listening is one of your career superpowers, because sometimes we don't realize the power either as introverts or as listeners. And I'm not trying to suggest that introverts are only the good listeners. You can be a good listener and be an extrovert too. So I'm curious for you, Patrick, for a lot of people, there are moments in their career where they went, oh my goodness, if only I would have listened, I wouldn't have made that mistake. Did that show up in a customer meeting for you, or did it show up in a work relationship? What was that listening moment for you? Could be listening to your new baby as well, right? Because I'm sure they're teaching you how to listen a little bit differently.
No, that part's that one's a non-stop ongoing one. So that one I won't use an example, but yeah, there was one example I can think of, which essentially kick-started, I guess, my second career. So in my last role, I was given one of the key accounts for a global company. And we had no relationships, and we were competing against people that already had existing, 5 to 10 year relationships, right? So why are they, potentially going to come work with us? And the key thing was, to cut it short, was that because we actually listened to all their pain points, in terms of why, from a recruitment perspective, what they didn't, what they weren't getting from their competitors, what they weren't getting from as a service for, the money that they're paying for. So we took all of that in account. So I spent an hour just literally listening, writing it all down, and then didn't really, say anything at the time. So it wasn't like, hey, look, I'm going to give you a solution straight away or halfway through what you're talking. Just sat there, listened, didn't say anything. Cool, I'll come back to you, in a few days with, this is what we're going to do. So, we addressed each point, made a pitch, and then fast forwarded. We ended up, for example, there was one division that I had 100 contractors. Within 1 year, we had 80 of them. And then, by that end, and then they introduced us into other areas. So that was, I guess, a key thing in terms of how important listening was. And in that instance, I think sometimes in sales, you always want to say, and you want to come across like everything, but I think it is equally as important to just sit back and, listen to what the customer wants, essentially.
Yeah, and I think in the markets you operate in, the buyers are quite sophisticated. And one thing you highlighted really well there is the difference between hearing and listening is the action you take. So a lot of people hear things, but when you listen effectively, you actually take action that means something to the person speaking. Too many people hear a lot of things and don't do it. A really good example of that are customer satisfaction surveys and employee engagement surveys, where people get asked and have to fill in forms repeatedly, but nobody's really taking action when it comes to listening. I'd love to ask the group a question right now, Patrick.
Definitely.
And let's have some fun. Let's play with the chat. What's one thing that really frustrates you when other people aren't listening to you? I think pop that in the chat. It could be about where their eye contact is. It could be about where their mobile phone is. It could be about the time of day that people are having the conversation. It could be about having to repeat yourself. In the chat, what's one thing that really frustrates you when other people aren't listening to you?
Hey, Oscar, would you mind sharing that screen, sharing your screen so everybody can see like in the big?
Oh, you can just pin me there and
Okay, yep.
put me in the spotlight there.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Does that make it easier for everyone?
Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Washington, for the
No worries,
technology help. So what's one thing that really frustrates you? Pop that in the chat.
I guess one thing I can say that, here we go. Okay, cool. We got Craig. So Craig says, creates additional work to explain again or correct afterwards if the wrong things get done. What are your thoughts, Oscar?
Well, let's see what everyone says, because this is actually a listening exercise for all of us to be listening to each other on this call as well. So there's more expertise in this room on listening from everyone than there is only from me. So please, I'm sure you know what really frustrates you when other people don't listen to you. With no training whatsoever, we all know when people aren't listening to us. And I think what it will do is help you understand the different ways people get frustrated when it comes to listening. Because here's the dirty little secret. When we go through and see everything that's in the chat, I'm sure each of us will be guilty of one of these things at some point along the way. What's really interesting is that most of us think we're above average listeners. In fact, 83% of us think we're above average listeners. 86% of us think we're above average car drivers. And 81% of us think we're above average IQ. So statistically impossible, but we don't know what good listening is. But we sure as heck can talk about what bad listening looks like when someone else does it as well. So Patrick, I'm curious, what are the themes you're noticing there?
Yeah, feeling, I think what I can see is the feeling of, not being appreciated, not being respected, or, from a self-reflection, am I boring then, or am I not, kind of getting their attention? Not feeling recognized, appreciation. I think that's the kind of trend that I'm seeing.
Yeah. And Washington, by the way, you might want to let Ed into the room. He's been waiting out there for a little while we're all kicking off at the beginning there. Thanks. I think one of the things you want to notice first when it comes to your listening preferences is, do you listen for similarities or do you listen for differences? Most of us aren't even conscious of this. When it comes to listening, we have different colored glasses when it comes to our listening. And for most of us, if we're taught in a Western education system in the English language, the education system actually teaches you to listen for similarities, and you take this bias into your workplace. Now, an exercise I want you to do right now, reading and listening have a lot in common. The speed at which you read, your comprehension, all these things can be improved just like listening can. And what I want you to do is, when you read all the comments, were you drawn in to the comments that were similar to you, or were you noticing the ones that were different? So just in the chat, again, put the letter S for similarities or D for differences. Do you think you consistently listen for similarities, or do you think you consistently listen for differences? And I'm going to give you another dirty little secret. Neither is right or wrong. I'm going to talk about when they are appropriate effective and productive when it comes to your listening orientation. So again, we're seeing a good chunk of S's coming through there. A lot of people looking, reading, listening for similarities. And Patrick, that shows up in our workplaces as groupthink when it's done ineffectively. Everybody kind of says the same things, they use the same language, they come to the same conclusions, and we rarely solve the systemic problems. Now, listening for similarities is really good when you're trying to drive cohesion, collaboration, consistency. But when it comes to listening for differences, you want to make sure you're hearing from voices that are outside the norm. You want to start to listen for voices that not necessarily are always heard. Listen carefully for those voices that don't say anything. Are you consistently bringing them in? And when you see divergent opinions, are you ignoring them because they're not from your professional background? Maybe they're not from your cultural background. Maybe they're not even from your age group. Maybe they speak a completely different first home mother tongue to you. And a lot of us dismiss opinions really quickly. You know, one of my heroes, I guess, is a basketball-loving ophthalmologist. His name is Dr. Wei-Ling Lee. And on the 30th of December 2019, Dr. Lee sent a WeChat message to his 5 basketball buddies from college. And he said to them, be careful. There's a SARS-like virus that is killing our elderly. Look after your elders. Look after your grandparents. And about 6 days later, Dr. Wei-Ling Lee got a knock on his door from the Wuhan police, who'd seen the message on WeChat and told him to take it off, to remove the message. It was wrong. And being a man of ethics, he was given a couple of days and he said, look, I have to think about it before I take it down. And for the next couple of days, he was continuing to look after patients in the Wuhan hospital, but unfortunately, he contracted the coronavirus himself. And between the time he sent the message and the 6 days where he contracted corona, and eventually only 9 days later, he passed away, the virus spread from Wuhan to Milan, and the virus spread from Wuhan to Seattle on the west coast of the United States. And the rest is history. And I think before we judge the Chinese authorities too harshly, what do we do with opinions that we disagree with? Listening is the willingness to have your mind changed. Listening is being open to exploring possibilities rather than discovering options. And for many of us, we're just not even conscious that we are listening for similarities or we are listening for differences. Patrick, I didn't get a chance to look at yours in the chat. What's your primary default when it comes to your listening?
Yeah, similarities. Because I think as well, me being in a sales role, that's kind of my job, right? To look for cues of my clients to make sure that they can, I can build a good impression with them in a short period of time. So looking for similarities in that sense, which now you're making me realize might not always be the best thing.
Well, here's the thing. When you want to form a connection, similarities are important. But when it comes to creating value, you need to be different, don't you? And you just showcased earlier on how you listened carefully and came up with a very different proposal for this client in the recruiting space, and you were successful there. By the way, there's no real formal Q&A at the end. I encourage questions all the way along. And between Washington and Patrick, they'll keep an eye on the question that is coming through on the chat, and I'll be happy to answer them now or at an appropriate time where I'll discuss that as well. One of the things we want to be conscious of when we're great listeners is being flexible enough to make a choice. And the choice is this. Somebody who's an okay listener will turn up with their default listening style, but a great listener will decide, what do I need to do in this moment to listen either for similarities or listen for differences? And sometimes that's going to vary during the meeting. It's going to vary across the types of meetings you deal with. It's also going to vary across the kinds of people you talk to. Now, it's important to know that listening is situational, it's relational, and it's contextual. You'll listen differently to an accountant than you will to an actor. You'll listen differently to a principal at school versus a police officer. And you'll listen differently to somebody who's in the pharmaceutical industry versus somebody who's in the financial services industry. You'll listen differently to your parents than you will a sibling. You'll listen differently to your children than you will to your nieces, nephews, and extended family. So our listening varies across the relationships, the length of the relationships. Our listening also varies based on the kind of content we're talking about as well. And the first thing it comes down to is your attention. Where's your attention right now? For some of us, right now, we're giving our attention. We're being generous, we're being curious, we're being empathetic. And being someone who's giving attention is something that you can do with a little bit of ease, a little bit of grace. It doesn't feel like it's hard. The other thing you can do is to pay attention. Pay attention feels like it's your duty, it's taxation, it's something you have to do. So when you jump on a plane eventually and the flight attendants will read out the emergency procedures, you'll probably pay attention. I remember back in 1997, I was flying Sydney, Auckland, Wellington, and then back to Sydney in a week. And one Friday where we were flying into Wellington, Wellington is an awful airport. It's in between two big islands where there's massive wind funnels through. And if you Google airplanes in Wellington, you can see them landing with their wings at an angle. And we had circled 3 times and aborted the landing 3 times on this Friday. And the pilot said, and he made an announcement, we will make a final approach. We will be making an emergency landing. I need you to give your full and undivided attention to our flight attendants who are going to go through the safety procedure. Well, I had never in my entire life given so much attention to that little flight card. I looked at it both ways. I looked where the doors were. I counted the doors. My attention was firmly in that moment. And although regularly we travel, it wasn't until that moment where the pilot said, we're going to have to make an emergency landing. We need to go through the emergency procedures. And I was like, what was that brace position again? Do you mind saying that again? How do you do the brace? I'm sitting in this chair. I look at the piece of paper, and it was the bumpiest landing we ever did. And it was the first time in my life I've actually had fire brigade driving past the plane as I landed. But in that moment, my attention was completely fixed. In that moment, I was giving my complete and undivided attention. Right now for you, are you thinking about MasterChef and the 2-minute noodle challenge? Are you thinking about the dinner you wish you would have had before you came on? What are you thinking about right now? I'm curious, are you giving attention or are you paying attention? Just put the word give or pay in the chat. I'd be curious to see where everyone's at right now. Patrick, you had a bit of a laugh. I sense you're a MasterChef kind of food fundy, right?
Yeah, and also the fact that one of the contestants is my best friend's sister, so got a little bit of personal, adding there. So
okay,
yeah.
Is she still in the show?
She still is in the show, so yeah.
Awesome, fantastic.
I'm gonna sneakily see if I can get out of her who the winner is, and maybe do something with that knowledge. Don't know.
Sounds completely unethical to me. All right, so we've got a good range: give, pay, give, pay attention. And Jeffrey says that camera trick is awesome. Okay, I'm not sure which camera trick you're talking about, Jeffrey. Is it that one or is it that one? When it comes to giving or paying attention, have you ever had a conversation with someone and your listening batteries are completely drained? Well, that's what giving attention for too long feels like. So giving attention or paying attention, neither is right or wrong. It's what's appropriate for the situation. By the way, here's a dirty little secret of listening. You can listen continuously for 12 seconds. You can listen continuously for 12 seconds. So you are going to be distracted all throughout our conversation today. You'll be distracted by me asking Patrick questions. You'll be distracted by the noise when somebody comes into the room. You'll be distracted by something that's happening in the room you're in right now. And you might be distracted by your mobile phone as well. So when it comes to our listening, that's the first thing we want to know, that we will be distracted. Now, I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to everybody who filled in the listening quiz. So these are the people who filled in the quiz. And what we've got here is a group of people who are lost and shrewd, and then interrupting is kind of about where everybody normally is. And then we got dramatic. So I want to take a bit of time. If you haven't had a chance to visit listeningquiz.com, I know that at least 15% of the audience on average who haven't taken the quiz, when I say listeningquiz.com, go and do the listening quiz while I'm talking. I'm okay with that. My job is to keep you interested and make sure that I'm interesting. So the lost listener is somebody that's struggling with two things: internal distractions, external distractions. The external distractions are typically electronic or environmental. Electronic, the notifications that might be coming up on your screen right now in Slack, in WhatsApp, in your email notifications, in the chat room that's inside Zoom right now. So that's one of the first levels of distraction, is electronic, but they might also be internal distractions. You know, when Oscar said Wellington, New Zealand, you might have said, oh, it's time to go to Queenstown. It's nearly winter and there's lots of snow, and I love snow. And the last time I went to New Zealand and went skiing, wow, that was amazing. And you start to drift away and you think about the trip to New Zealand and you're lost. But lost listeners also show up as people who turn up to a meeting. They don't know why they're there. They've been invited, but they're not sure why. The people being polite and inviting them. So here's a tip if you're one of the lost listeners in the group. If you've been invited to a meeting and you're being polite and turn up, before the meeting kicks off, just ask the host this question: what's your expectation of me during this meeting? What's your expectation of me during this meeting? If you're a lost listener, that's a great question to put into your back pocket. Honestly, it's not a question for the host. It's a question for you to help you focus during the meeting. So when you get lost and distracted, you got to remember, this is my purpose in the meeting. Because a lot of people don't ask that question at the beginning of the meeting. By the way, Patrick, did you take the quiz?
I did.
All right, don't tell us anything about yourself. We'll come back to that.
I was about to, but yes, I'll refrain.
All right, the next level, or the highest level in this group, is interrupting. The interrupting villain is the quiz show contestant that presses the buzzer really early. They value productivity and time, but in answering the question early, they generally answer the wrong question, and they take away, they erode, they frustrate the other person, and they ultimately take away trust in a relationship. If you're interrupting a listening villain, just remember this: count 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000 when they draw breath. When they draw breath as the speaker, that's not your commercial break to let them know how great you are and how fast you are and how quick you are. Now, interrupting listening villains, they want to engage quicker, faster, and get to the outcome as quickly as possible. It's okay, but you will do that at a price, and the price is the relationships that you erode. And if you really struggle to count 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000 in your head when they draw breath, count 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000 while they draw breath, and bite your tongue at the same time. You will definitely not interrupt. So when it comes to our listening, most people can spot an interrupting listener really, really easily. But the next villain here is the shrewd listening villain. And the shrewd listening villain is the opposite of the interrupting. They'll lean back. Now imagine this was the closed captioning, because they don't say much, the shrewd listening villain. The shrewd listening villain listens carefully, gives you great face, and you lull them into this state where they kind of talk, but what they can see is you're trying to solve their problem. You're so shrewd that your closed captioning goes, oh my goodness, I am an expert in this field. This is such a basic problem. Oh my God. I've solved that, but you don't say it out aloud. You just say it to yourself. And then you say, I've already thought about 2 problems they haven't even anticipated. I wish they'd hurry up because I'm really smart and shrewd. But what the other person, the speaker, can see, they can see the cogs going on in your wheel as you're trying to problem solve for them. So if you are a shrewd listening villain, what your job is to focus on how they say something, not just what they say. Too many shrewd listening villains are too busy problem solving that they end up solving the wrong problem because they're like a doctor that doesn't fully listen to the patient's symptoms. That might be you. The final listening villain is dramatic. The dramatic listening villain is somebody who loves to connect emotionally. Patrick mentioned this earlier on. He likes to find out what's in common between him and the person he's trying to build a relationship with. Unfortunately, the dramatic listening villain makes it all about them. You think you've got a bad boss and you talk about a terrible boss you've got in a conversation, and they'll say to you, wow, that sounds awful. Let me tell you about a boss I had. They were even worse than this boss that you've got. Oh, you're going through a terrible merger that's all over the place. I've had a worse merger than that. And for many of us, what we're trying to do is form a connection, but we're being sympathetic rather than empathetic. So for many of us, just knowing who our listening villain is quite often enough for us to start to make a difference. Now, Patrick, what are your villains? But before you tell us, Patrick, let me tell you mine. Okay. So I'm a shrewd listening villain at work, but at home, I'm a lost listener. And on Sundays, we have the in-laws and the outlaws and the family over for lunch. And my 2 brother-in-laws just bang on about religion. That's all they talk about. They're like this. They go on and on about the same thing pretty much every Sunday. It's the religion of Canon versus the religion of Nikon. They can't convince each other that anything, and all they talk about is f-stops and ISO and all this stuff and automatic versus manual. And occasionally they humor me and ask me a question and I go, I don't know, my camera is my iPhone. But I'm completely lost in that conversation, Patrick. What about you? What sort of villains show up for you?
So according to the quiz, my primary one is a dramatic listener.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting because listening to you, obviously, and the way you mentioned it is a lot more clearer than I think what I was reading. But yeah, I think it's like you said, the sympathetic versus empathetic at times, because as I mentioned, part of my job is 99. The only people I talk to now are either my clients or pretty much my kid who can't talk. So it's pretty much my clients, right? So a lot of the times it is trying to build that connection, and then talking, and obviously with the the current situation, just trying to find the common sort of scenarios and things that we've done. Otherwise, the secondary one was the shrewd listener.
Yeah. And look, a lot of people often ask, Oscar, what's the difference between sympathy and empathy? Sympathy is you saying you feel the same way as them. Oh, Patrick, I feel terrible for you. As opposed to, hey, Patrick, I can acknowledge that that's tough for you. The second one is empathy. That means you're not transferring your emotion onto them. You're just acknowledging where they're at. And for many of us, sympathy is something that we get into too quickly, and it's not often productive. So what we want to do is acknowledge the situation for them rather than saying you feel exactly the same way for them as well. So, for many of us, knowing the difference between sympathy and empathy is really critical. If you want to understand more about this, the highly recommend the work of Brené Brown in any of her books. She spends a lot of time talking about the difference between sympathy and empathy. And occasionally sympathy is useful and productive, but rarely is that the case. So what you want to do is acknowledge how they're feeling, but not necessarily saying you feel the same way in that regard as well. For many of us, we don't even realize that there's 5 levels of listening. And I just wanted to spend a wee bit of time today on that, Patrick. But before I do, are there any questions in the Q&A panel that we should be chatting about, or Washington?
You've already answered one of them. Robert asked about the difference between sympathetic and empathetic, which you've already answered, which was good. Any other question, guys?
That's okay if there isn't.
Yep.
And thanks for the link to Brené Brown. And my guess is that that is the video where Brené describes the difference between sympathy and empathy. Am I correct? I got a big head nod there from Amy.
Yeah, it is.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a great video. How long is it? About 4 minutes? Oh, you're going to do a bit of Googling for me
There's a
now?
short one. No, I don't know. I watched it before.
Yeah. Awesome. So here's a question for you. What's the cost of not listening inside the organizations you work for or work with? Pop that in the chat box. What's the cost of not listening in the organizations you're part of? Yeah, Jeffrey, with your one, I think, and eventually the worst situation is they stop caring. The best situation is they could leave. I think in those situations, they just leave. Great people leave the organization way earlier than in others. Jeffrey, any in there that you noticed that surprised you?
Not really. I mean, I expected all of these ones. Yeah, I mean, yeah, pretty much. I think, well, you know me, I believe listening is probably one of the most important skills that you must have, and probably one of the most underrated skills, especially in a career like, especially in an area like sales. So yeah, so I'm certainly one of those that believe that listening is probably the center of what every great leader should be doing.
Yeah, and look, for Hannah, for Ed, for Penelope, Lucy, Rachel, Christine, Cyrus, love to hear from you in the chat. Robert, there's a range of really consistent voices, and if you host meetings where there's a large number of people, make sure you listen in the chat for the people who haven't spoken up as well. I think great insight there, Lucy, and Megumi, thank you, and Avi, thank you, and Ivan, and Pat, and Miguel. But there's a lot more of us, and honestly, I know the answer. It's really important that you put your answers in so the group can learn from each other. And the wider the range and the more diverse costs, that we can start to think about listening in a really, really different way. And when it comes to listening, most people think that listening starts with the speaker, and it's the wrong place to start. Listening starts by listening first to you, and most of us aren't ready to listen to ourselves. Most of us have some kind of noise playing in our head, and we can't pay attention to the speaker because we are listening to the noise. It could be the last conversation replayed in our head about someone we're just speaking to now. So for many of us, don't focus. Do not focus on the speaker before you start. Focus on yourself. Switch off your electronic notifications. That's the first step. In our database of 1,410 people, we know that people who switch off the notifications increase their listening by at least 50% and get 2 hours a week back in their schedule. 2 other tips is drink a glass of water every 30 minutes. I missed that one. We're up to 44 now, so I'm going to have a glass of water. And then 3 deep breaths. 3 deep breaths. If you practice those 3 things consistently for 90 days, you'll get 4 hours a week back in your schedule. So for many of us, we're not even aware of that. The next level of listening is listening to content. When you listen to content, it's what you see, it's what you hear, and it's what you sense. Everybody probably does a great job of hearing in black and white where they see in color. So one of the things we want to do is extend our range of listening. For many of us, we see in colors, but we listen in black and white. Where you can make a big difference is start to sense, listen for emotion. Are people speaking from this part of the voice, or are people speaking from this part of the voice? I'm saying exactly the same words, but I'm saying it in quite a very different way. A lot of people say to me, oh, Oscar, COVID sucks. I can't read body language. Well, I can tell you what, you can learn a lot about people in this little triangle here, from the eyes down to the chin. The great thing about COVID is you can stare at someone through a webcam. They don't even know you're staring at them. If you wanted to have some fun, see if you can figure out what color my eyes are. When you get distracted, just focus on my eyes, see what my eye color is. Here's a little tip. My left eye color is slightly different from my right eye color. So when you get distracted today, just have a look at my eye color. Now, when it comes to listening, if we go back to the 12th century back in China, when they were teaching the emperors in their teenage years, they taught them about Ting. And the Mandarins were teaching them about Ting. Now, I am not a native Mandarin speaker. I am not from that culture. And if you pronounce Ting one way, it means to listen. And if you pronounce Ting another way, it means to stop speaking, to stop. Now, in the West, we love deconstructing things, but in the East, well, this is a unified character. And this is explaining 6 elements of listening: how you see, how you hear, are you present, are you focused, are you being respectful, and then finally, how are you right now? Are you listening to the feeling in their voice? I'm curious, which one of those 6 dimensions of listening do you think you could improve on? Pop that word in the chat. Maybe simply go, what's the one thing you want to focus on in terms of Ting for the balance of our time together? Pop that in the chat. Now, when it comes to our listening, most of us don't even know the neuroscience of listening. So you can listen at I can speak at 125 words a minute, but you can listen at 400. In fact, if I go to 200 words per minute and sound like a cattle yard auctioneer or a horse race caller, you can understand everything I'm saying with complete comprehension. We know that blind people can listen to audiobooks and podcasts at 3 times speed and still retain complete comprehension. And most of us probably listen to YouTube channels beyond 1 time speed. If you're guilty of listening to a YouTube video at more than 1 time speed, pop the word guilty in the chat box, because I'd be putting guilty, 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 because I can go up to 2 times speed for people whose accents I'm familiar with and the language that I'm familiar with as well. So Jeffrey's guilty times 2. And I'll be curious hearing from others. Hannah, I'd be loving to hearing from you, and Ed, Penelope, Lucy, and Rachel. Where are you at on that front as well? Level 3, when it comes to listening, is listening for patterns and context. And what we want to do, particularly in our career, when we think about listening across career, is start to listen for the themes, not only where we need to go well and play to our strengths, but where we need to partner with our weaknesses. Too many people think they need to fix their weaknesses, but many of us should be partnering with other people. I have this thing called dyscalculus. Dyscalculus means if you say the word 749 to me, I will more than likely write down 497 or 794 or something around the wrong way. For my entire career, whether that's in my personal finances or my workplace finances, I've made a point of being very, very good buddies with accountants, financial planners, CFOs, chief risk officers, commercial and operational leaders, because I can't do statistics to save myself. So if you're an accountant and got a finance background, a quick shout out to you and thank you for making my life easy, because I started life out as an audit clerk in an accounting firm. And in the 6th week, my manager diagnosed me with this thing called dyscalculus, which was fantastic. I started a career in the computer industry in the 1980s, and I'm very grateful for that. I was able to discover so much more. So for many of us listening for the context, level 3, listening for our own patterns and the patterns of others, that's really crucial. Now, when it comes to level 4, this is listening for what's unsaid. It's like, Oscar, I'm struggling to listen for what's said. What do you mean, listen for what's unsaid? Again, a commercial break from the neuroscience of listening. And this is the listening from the speaker's perspective. The speaker can speak at 125 words a minute, but they can think at 900 words per minute. So it means what they say the first time is only 11% of what they're thinking. So is there any wonder why there's confusion, chaos, and conflict in our workplaces? Because most of us are having conversations about 11% of what the other person's thinking. Here's the next dirty little secret of listening. It's not your job as the listener to make sense of what they're saying. It's your job to help them make sense of their thinking. It's not your job to understand what they're saying. It's your job to help them make sense of what they're thinking. And when you do, magic happens. When you help them out with that, this is what happens. They'll do something like, they'll go, actually, now that I think about it, or they'll say, actually, you know what's really important that we haven't discussed? Or they'll go, actually, that sounded a bit random. Now that I've thought about it a little longer, here's where we go. Some people call it the light bulb moment. Some people call it the aha moment, but it's probably happened to you, and it's probably happened to somebody that you have been speaking to if you waited long enough. So if you'd love 3 tips to listen for what's unsaid. You might see a bunch of Yodas in the background, by the way. You know, if Yoda was here, I don't know, does anybody talk Yoda talk? How would he say, listen for what's unsaid? Pop it in the chat box if you're a Star Wars fan. I'm not a Star Wars fan, by the way, but people keep sending me all these baby Yoda dolls that I put in the background here. And I'm always happy to put them up. Here's 3 tips so you can listen not just to 11% of what they're saying, but the next 22% and the next 33%. And when you do, you start to listen to bigger, more systemic issues rather than symptoms. So here's the first one. Linguistically, a question should be less than 8 words. 8 words or less is a neutral question. So the shorter the question, the better. So the first question you want to ask is, tell me more. Or make it your own and say, I'm curious, tell me more about that. Or, wow, tell me more. Make it your own. The first tip is tell me more. The next one, and what else? Now you can use these interchangeably. You can use one first and the next one second. But by using these words, you will get them to speak the next 125 words. And they will have that moment where they go, thanks, Jeffrey. I've actually solved it myself. we can make this meeting shorter. Thanks a lot. Or thanks, Washington. That was great. Now that I think about it, I've got 2 alternatives. I'm going to go away and work on alternative 1. Now, the third tip is really powerful. So be careful with this one. This is so powerful that it can either feel like you're intimidating the witness in a court case, or it can be liberating. This is the shortest of all, but used effectively, it's the most powerful. So listen carefully to this one. Here it comes. Now, don't worry, my webcam didn't freeze. There's no coincidence that silent and listen have the same letters. And if you just pause, they will fill in the gap and they will discover their own insight in that moment. So those 3 tips, if you wanted to take one photo today of a screen or a screenshot, this is the one I'd be taking if I was taking a screenshot today. These are the 3 power questions that you can get to listen to what's unsaid. Now, there's 5 levels of listening, and too many of us just listen for what people say rather than what they mean. So I want to tell you a story about Jenna. Jen is a mum in Ohio in the United States, and her 6-year-old son, Christopher, came home from school one day at the age of 6 and said, "Mummy, Mummy, I'm so excited we learned maths today." And she said, "Honey, what did you learn about maths?" And he said to his mum, he said, "I learned that 3 is half of 8. And she thought she misheard him. And she said, "Christopher, honey, could you say that again?" And he said, "Yeah, Mummy, 3 is half of 8. She put her hands in her head because she was a kindergarten teacher and she's now raising her children at home. And she went to the cupboard, grabbed 8 M&Ms, lined them up on the kitchen table, 4 in one row, 4 in the other, picked up her son, put him on the kitchen table and said, "Christopher, honey, here's 4 M&Ms. Here's 4 M&Ms. Unfortunately, 4, not 3 is half of 8. And he leaps off the table and said, "Mummy, Mummy," and he goes and grabs a piece of paper and he draws the figure 8 on this piece of paper. And it kind of looks like this. And what he does is he grabs a piece of paper, draws the 8, he folds it in half. And then he folds it in half again. And then he tears it in half. And he shows it to his mum and says, "Look, Mum, 3 is half of 8. And for many of us, we go through having conversations with people in the workplace, absolutely certain that 4 is half of 8 because we've been trained that way, we went to university that way, and we can't listen to the fact that 3 is also half of 8. By the way, 0 is also half of 8 as well. See if you can figure that one out while we're waiting. Now, here's the backstory about Christopher. Today, with a computer science degree, Christopher is a bug catcher for one of the world's largest software companies and solving the most complex problems. Christopher is on the autism spectrum, and because his mum listened to his story that 3 is half of 8, he was able to get diagnosed at the age of 6 and led an amazingly productive life on one part of the spectrum. For many of us, we need to envisage a future where 4 is half of 8, 3 is half of 8, and 0 is half of 8. The world is full of possibilities, and the difference between people who hear and those that listen are those that can imagine multiple possibilities, because the future doesn't belong to software. It belongs to the imagination of humans that code the software that they put together. I'm Oscar Trimboli. I'm on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world. You've given me the greatest gift of all today. You've listened to me. Thanks for listening. Back to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Oscar. That was a really good example, the last one. So thank you, really appreciate that. And look, thanks everyone for listening to Oscar and again, using obviously taking the time on a Thursday night to listen. And I hope it was very beneficial for everyone. So on behalf of PDF, thanks again. And just before I go, just wanted to mention in 2 weeks' time, we do have our next session, which Rada will be doing, which is talking to Elizabeth Lee, who is an ACT Liberal leader, and the topic is taking your seat at the table in regards to politics. So thanks again, everyone. Have a good night, and yeah, stay safe.
Thank you, Oscar. That was phenomenal.
That's yeah, like people on the spectrum is actually like, you know, they see things differently. So long time ago they used to be discounted, right? But like a lot of professionals have realized that because they can see things that nobody else can see, then there's a lot of value in them.
Yeah. Yeah, I was interviewing somebody in Washington yesterday who was a real deep expert in a particular field of computer science. And when they see written words, every word is in a different color for them. So when they started to learn to read, it was weird for them because they were seeing certain words in red, certain words in green, and they were trying to explain that to the teacher. And they were diagnosed with this condition. But a lot of software companies and professional services firms are now actively recruiting people who have a different neurodiversity when it comes to the way they process the world, either visually, auditory, or the way they pattern match, because they do add vital different ways of thinking to complex problem solving.
Yeah, absolutely. And ties back to what you say about, like, you know, the introverts or people who are more quiet, because probably they listen very deep about whatever conversation is having, and they think in their mind as well from a different perspective, right?
Yeah, and they also excellent at synthesizing, so they can take complexity and put it into a framework. They can take complexity and put it into a sentence. They can put it into a story. They can put it into a sequence, and they help make sense of it for the room much faster. And it's not to say they're better or worse than an introvert or an extrovert. It's just which is useful in the moment. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, like, you know, that's why, like, we are easy to discount diversity. So I used to work in the public service, and, like, you know, unfortunately, public services, you know, notorious about the one that speaks the loudest get the attention, unfortunately. And then, but I tell you, like, the people who the most talented people are the one that are actually very quiet. I think there's only 2 leaders that appreciate those people, and they were like both women, and they would give credit. Like after the meeting finished, she know who the quiet people were. She would have a second meeting with them, and that's where, like, the best policies would come out from.
Yeah, and it's an insightful leader. And by the way, if you want to see a beautiful distillation of what quiet can do, Megumi, who was on today, has written a really powerful book called Quiet Leadership, and does a great job of interviewing quiet leaders, not just in Australia, but globally as well. And she's very skillful at helping introverts find their voice and be appropriate and effective where sometimes they might be shy and detached. I can talk on the topic for ages, but I need some questions.
So there was one of my pet topics, and I'm sure you've probably already heard this one before, but so there's many on this call who I know are very quiet people, you know, so shy and introverted. And
yeah,
part
all
of
their webcams are off.
Yes, but at the same time, you know, it's not from a lack of desire to want leadership and all of that as well. But how do you hang on, Darlene? Sorry,
bring her into the call, Jeffrey. Let her say hello.
All right, come on, say hi. Oh, sorry, say hi, Didi. Oh, sorry, darling. Oh, hang on.
All right, you go and sort it out, Jeffrey.
Sorry. All right, hang on. Somebody else take this turn first. I'm just gonna.
Annie, did you have a question? Annie is one of the quiet one in the room as well, but like she's always have some really interesting thoughts about things.
Yeah, the question I get often here is, I'm a great listener, but my boss is terrible. Does anybody have that problem?
how do you so what would advise in such a situation, like, because like, I think it's something that we fail to realize as well, that maybe something that we not communicate as well as we should, right?
Could you rephrase the question there,
No,
Washington?
like I should say, like, yeah, I'm guilty of that sometimes as well, that especially in the past, that trying to explain something and people just like I feel that people are not listening to it. But sometimes I would be thinking that maybe the way I phrase it or frame it was not adequate for them to listen to it.
Yeah, I think, Washington, you probably have a preference to communicate a particular way. So some really basic examples is some people talk in stories and some people talk in statistics. Some people talk about the past, some people talk about the future, some people talk about themselves, some people talk about the group, some people talk about internal, some people talk about external. Of all of those things, what do you think your preference is when you communicate? Is it about the detail?
Actually, no, I tend to go straight to the point, I guess.
Yeah.
Yep.
So one of the things you want to become conscious of is it's great to communicate from your preference, but it's more useful to communicate to their preference. So if they prefer statistics, you want to start with statistics. If they prefer a story or a framework, start that way. Do they prefer to draw on a whiteboard or on a piece of paper and make a diagram of it? Talk to them in that way. So I think if you can meet them in the middle, so that's in a one-on-one situation. In a group situation, the simplest way to do is always speak to story first and statistics second. Story opens up the mind, connects with them emotionally because they can find meaning in the story, and then you use evidence in there to get the rest of the room that's about sequence and detail. So too many of us communicate only from our preference and we don't have any kind of flexibility because, again, it's back to, do I listen for similarities or do I listen for differences? I listen in a default and you communicate, you speak in a default. So one of the things you want to notice is if you don't know the group, make sure you tell stories. So what did you notice about me today? Am I about stories or statistics?
I think you're like a storyteller, I would say.
Okay. Did you hear any statistics today?
Just a few key points there.
Yeah. So with a group I don't know, so I don't know this group, I'll always start with a story. What was the very first story I told today? Can you remember? It was when my boss said to me she wants to see me at the end of the meeting, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's the first story that I would tell, because it's a story that kind of underpins everything we go to when it comes to listening. But then I talked about the neuroscience of listening and the 125-400 rule and the 125-900 rule. So for those people skeptical about stories, then we start to give them some statistics, some data and some evidence. And that way you're talking to everybody in the audience there.
Yes. And for me, like, I think the most dramatic point was about the airplane thing. That one, really different. I'll remember you for that story, man. Absolutely.
There you go. I bet you never remember the 125-400 rule. I bet you never remember the 125-900 rule, but you will remember flying into Wellington.
Yes.
And if you've ever flown into Wellington, you can picture yourself in that story, because I've never landed in Wellington on a very smooth landing. I notice Miguel's got his hand up. He could be saying goodbye or he could have a question. I'm not sure. We'll find out soon enough.
Sorry, Miguel, we cannot hear you, mate.
He's practicing his silence.
Hello.
Aha, yeah, we can hear you now.
Yes, that does need a bit of practice, I have to admit. Sorry, I'm like, I have to confess though, you mentioned before I asked my question, I have to confess that once you said the 4 types of listening villains, and the first one you brought up was Lost, and you came right after that story, I was YouTubing like epic Wellington crosswind landings.
And what did you see?
It's pretty epic. I remember this, what you've said. Anyway.
Well, do you want to share one of the YouTubes in the chat so that everyone can have a giggle along as well?
I'll stay on topic before I probably share one. But one of the stats that struck me is mentioned like the 11% of what people say that you listen. How can you ensure, without having to be that guy who always puts his hand up to clarify, that the 11% that you got of the person's message actually matches the 11% they intended to show? Because you know about the 80-20 rule and how 80% of the substance comes from 20%. So I can imagine that the speaker actually intends for only that 11 or 20% to be the core message. How can you make ensure that you're on the same wavelength without having to be that guy who's always having to clarify things and always getting the wrong thing?
Yeah, and I think there's an assumption there that the person speaking actually knows what they mean the first time. So many linguists will say that the first 2 to 3 minutes is purely rehearsal. They haven't actually configured the way they speak effectively. Now, the way you may know they have is maybe they've written it down in the past, maybe they've put it in a document. So one of the great parallels for this is why Amazon don't use slides in meetings, and they have long form documents presented. So at the beginning of the meeting, you just read, everybody reads in silence about what the idea that's being presented. Now, one of the things you do when you type a document up is you edit your document. You would never present the first thing you write, yet there's a supposition that the very first thing you say is what you mean. And linguists will say that you need to get to about the 3-minute mark before you're coherent. So when you think about that, that's 125, 125, 125. So you've got to get to about 375 words before you can get to coherence. Now, if you have some kind of expertise in the topic, you may be able to frame it more specifically. But for the vast majority of people, if you're dealing with the following: complex, collaborative, creative, constrained situations, which I would say probably defines the working environment of pretty much everybody on this call, you can actually think it up to 1,600 words per minute. So the maths gets worse. The first 125 words you say is only 5% of what you mean, unless you're incredibly rehearsed. So the phrase you want to be good at, one of the things there, Miguel, that you're going towards is this. A lot of people think that good listening is like therapy in the workplace, and it's not. A very good listener in the workplace is actually a skillful interrupter. And in that context, what you want to do, if they've said something and you want to understand what that means, a question I practice really often with people is, if that was a subject line in an email, what would that sound like? And then they get the 125 words down to less than 8. And I guarantee you what those 8 words are compared to the original 125 words, the meaning is radically different. So you don't have to be the guy that always says, tell me more. Could you expand on that? I'm curious what else you're thinking about on this topic. Sometimes you want to get them to abbreviate. You want to get them to shorten. You want to be like a book editor that helps a writer get a whole bunch of words into a very clarified position. Another technique that's used is, so if that was a book title, what would it be? If that was a newspaper headline, what would it say? What would the movie trailer version of that be? And then that way, again, it gives them the opportunity to distill what they're saying into much fewer but more impactful words. But your job is to create the space for them to do that, Miguel.
Interesting. So in that context, though, do you feel that it's actually a journey of going together with them? So you actually have this continuous bouncing ball where you say, if I understand right, if I understand you correctly, then is X or Y what you mean? And then you actually work together with the speaker to help that happen?
Yeah, so that's kind of, the language you're using is a kind of bit biased from your perspective. Your job is to help them. So when you say what I heard or whatever, you want to get them to the point that they're describing what they mean rather than what they say. So what they say the first time, again, rarely what they mean. I'll give you a really practical example of this. I was doing a workshop in 2015 in Melbourne in a really, I can remember it like it was yesterday because it was a really narrow boardroom. It was really dusty. Have you ever walked into one of those rooms where they've got whiteboard marker dust still dripping off the dusters and it's falling all over the place? And it just feels claustrophobic. And it was just before 1 o'clock. And I know this because we were having lunch. And we'd gone around the room and I'd asked the group to describe this organization. I said, describe this organization as an animal. And everyone described it. It was like a bird of prey. It was a sea eagle. It was a seagull. It was swooping. It was fast. It was all of that. And I was looking directly at the CEO, and there was one person who hadn't spoken up. She was from finance. Her name was Elaine. And I just turned to her. I didn't say anything. And I just put my hand out. And Elaine said, I thought it was obvious. And that's all she said. And I just slowly moved to a side to encourage her, but not move towards her. I didn't say anything. And I could see out of the corner of my eye, you know, those comic strips where you got the crazy villain with the X-ray eyes trying to blow the head off the superhero. Well, that's what was happening to me. The CEO was obviously really hungry and we were past 10 past by now. And I think he wanted to eat lunch. And then Elaine said again, I thought it was really obvious. I thought we were a snake. You could have heard a pin drop in the room. So the whole room has said, we're a bird of prey, we're a seagull, we're fast moving, we're all these things. She says the group is a snake. Now, this is important about listening for unsaid and listening for differences. And I just put my hand out a little bit further. And I didn't say, tell me more. I didn't say, what do you mean? I just put my hand out a bit further. And then she continued and she said, I thought it was obvious we are a snake. In the past, we have shed our skin and adapted for what the client needs. But we've forgotten to shed our skin and we've become slow and we have become heavy and we can't adapt in the way we have in the past. Now, for most people, when I say snake in the West, they associate that with negatives. There's a whole story in Christianity about people being tempted by a snake and Adam and Eve and all of that. But you see, Elaine was from China, and in China, the snake has a very different meaning to those in the West. And it wasn't till 1:35, Miguel, that conversation stopped because the group realized that Elaine was actually right. But they weren't a swooping seagull, eagle, beautiful bird of prey. They'd become fat, slow, and heavy and forgotten to shed their skin and look after their clients. And the rest of the meeting had a very different perspective. In that moment, I didn't even have to say a word, but create the space for Elaine to say what she meant. And she changed the perspective of everybody in the room. Obviously a card-carrying member of the introvert community. And I'm still dealing with the laser beam in the back of my head from the CEO who didn't get to eat his salad sandwich in the moment. But those extra 35 minutes completely changed the trajectory of the rest of the day. And more importantly for this software company, their export strategy as well. So sometimes the most powerful way you can help somebody say what they mean is by saying absolutely nothing to them.
That's pretty powerful, Oscar. If I could go back to the question I was trying to formulate before my little one came in.
Miguel, the master of all the elephants in the room, like he's got so much photographic action happening. It's amazing. All right, Jeffrey, I interrupted. Back to your question you were formulating. Is your daughter okay?
That's actually my son. But,
Is your son okay?
No, he's fine. He's fine. He was just looking for mum. So what I was trying to get it to was that for those who are introverted and and are quieter, how do you make your listening? How do you use your listening skills to, I suppose, make up for that shortfall, right? I mean, it's one of those important skills that's overlooked, but at the same time, how can you use it to help you gain an advantage in the workplace if you're someone that don't speak a lot or a bit quieter?
I'm going to talk about two contexts: one-on-one context and group context. Which one do you want to go with first?
Let's go for the group context first.
Okay. So in a group context, one of the things introverts should practice, we imagine we're coming into a room, whether it's a physical or virtual room, it doesn't matter. Ask the host this question: what role do you want me to play in this meeting? And the second part is, what would make this a great meeting for the group? Not for the host, but for the group. Then your job is to listen through that lens and speak up when you notice the meeting is drifting away from that position. Hey, host, earlier on you mentioned blah, blah, blah. I think, can we just do a time check? Because I think we're going down a rabbit hole that's not connected to that. And then the flip side is, in a group meeting, what somebody who's an introvert does very well is they connect. So your job is listen to the purpose of the meeting and connect it with customers, connect it with other departments, connect it with people who aren't present in the room, and say, hey, host, one of the things you said earlier on was yada, yada, yada. When I think about our customers, I think a question they'd ask about that right now is blah, 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 blah. So oftentimes we think there's something at risk if we speak up and provide our opinion. But if you can bring an external perspective into that conversation, whether it's another department, somebody who's not there, could be a supplier, could be a regulator, could be the media, it doesn't matter. It's easier for extroverts to ask a question on behalf of someone else quite often than it is for them to ask the question on their own behalf. Now, I'm curious, Jeffrey, if you could use that in real life yourself.
Yeah, definitely. I think that would be very helpful. So, yep.
All right, we're at 22 past the hour. Let's go to 25 past, and I'm sensing the energy is going down in the question departments. I'm really grateful for everyone staying behind, because guess what? The biggest learnings are at the end of the conference when the person comes off stage and everybody walks up to ask a question, and the really useful learnings is the Q&A after, don't you think?
Absolutely. All right. I was actually hoping for one of the quieter ones to pop in, hence that question.
Pat, what's happened on MasterChef, mate?
Not sure. I just had to go attend to my little one, so that's why I had to step out. He's not sleeping well, but yeah. I guess one question I have, right, is in regards to, because I think when you're, sorry, what I'm trying to say is, when in the sales environment, the listening aspect obviously is clearly important, right? But I guess what's something, I think, from your perspective that you've seen that makes maybe someone stand out a bit more than, or differentiates from the others, maybe from a listening perspective?
In regard to a selling scenario or something else? I'm not clear.
So yeah, so if I apply it back to my situation in terms of selling or being in sales, what's something, I guess, that you've seen that's been quite successful for maybe people that are successful in that industry, that they do from a listening context, if that makes sense? Yeah.
And for Miguel, notice how different the first question Pat asked me was compared to the second question. Washington's nodding his head furiously there as well. So don't be afraid.
I was trying to gather my thoughts.
Yeah, No, and while you were out, we were actually talking about that very fact, that what people say the first time is unedited, and second time they kind of clarify. So a couple of things that consistently differentiate listening for world-class sellers is two things. The first one is great sellers listen for the customer's business case, not to beat the competition. Anybody can beat the competition, but if you can help the customer create a business case for finance for what they're buying, you will consistently have more predictable sales. The second thing great sellers do is they don't sell just to the customer. They help the customer solve their customers' problems consistently as well. So everybody says, be customer centric. I say that's a load of rubbish. Be focused on your customer's problem, and nobody will ever be able to beat you in sales. And you need to listen for their customers' problems. So a lot of the work I do with software sales organizations and professional sellers, they will all say they're obsessed about customer centricity and all of that. I go, great. Tell me about your customers. And they go, well, no, we're focused on our customers. I said, yeah, if you are, you'd be focused on their customers. Now, some people say they are, and to some extent they are. What you want to do is actually focus on your customers' problems. If you can explain the customer's problems better than the customer can, they already think you've got a solution. So how do you create listening beyond the boundaries of the organizations you're selling into? That's really powerful. And what it gives you as a seller, consistent, predictable revenue, but more importantly, you build a brand as a trusted advisor. No matter what product you sell, no matter what organization you're in, you'll take your customers with you. For bonus points, Patrick, the CIOs, the CFOs, the CMOs, the CIOs I work with directly say the best sellers are the ones who are exceptional at saying this: I can't solve that problem for you, but I can recommend somebody who can.
Oh, that's an interesting one.
So listen carefully to the bigger problem the client has, not just the problem you can fix for them as well. I'll tell you a story about a CIO I pitched to in 2005. And he explained what he was trying to achieve. And I said to him in 2005, I'm not the right person for you, and we're not the right organization. I can recommend you exactly to the right person. Would that be more helpful? He said, sure, please. I said, I'm going to give him a call right now because it was relatively urgent. It was a security issue. And got through, handed the phone over. I walked out of the room. They had a yak and he hung up and whatever. Now, I never actually sold anything to that CIO. Not that year, not the next year. But that CIO has recommended and referred me to people that have sold or bought from me 10 times more than I could ever have sold to that CIO, because I was solving his immediate problem just by connecting him with my network, rather than trying to shoehorn and finagle some kind of security thing that we could kind of do on a rainy day if the sun was creaking through the side and the moon was at a half moon, and you know, Jupiter was in orbit around this way and the magnetic poles were all lined up. Maybe on one day the security thing we had might solve the problem. But I was listening for his bigger problem, and it wasn't what we could provide. And by me recommending him immediately, literally, here's the phone, here's this person, that generated a lot of goodwill for a long term. So for bonus points, double bonus points, set up Google alerts, first name, last name of the client you're working with and their organization name. And you'll be surprised what pops up there and gives you a reason to go and ring the client, congratulate them, or think about a problem they're working on as well.
Thank you.
Pleasure. There's a bit of free consulting.
That's it. No.
Miguel, what's the next photo, mate? We've got the elephant in the room. What's the metaphor for the last one? All right, working hard on it, I can see. All right, for those of you listening on the recording, I hope you've been listening at 2 times speed. Miguel, I reckon you're trying to say something, but you got the same problem with the Bluetooth not connecting on your computer. Okay, he's muted, he's unmuted.
No, it's okay. It's okay, Oscar. I'm all good. Just been listening in.
Okay, awesome, awesome. All right, 8:30. Time for me to go and see what they've done with the 2-minute noodles on MasterChef. And what's your friend's sister's name, Patrick?
Linda.
Linda.
Yeah, so she won't be competing this one, but yeah, she's good at balancing flavors, from what I can say.
Ah, okay, because you've obviously tasted her food.
No, I've tasted the sister's food, but not her food. I didn't realize she was even that good of a cook. So yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. No.
All right, we'll speak soon.
Thanks again, Oscar. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening.
See you, mate.